Okay, folks, we might get underway with our second panel this morning. And this panel discussion is going to focus on living independently and being included in the community. So we'll have three panelists sharing insights into achieving the right to independent living for disabled children and young people, and how they can be supported to live in and be active members of their communities. We're going to have three panelists, and I'll introduce them in turn before they make their presentations. Three presentations again from this panel, and then we're going to have it open to the floor and the discussion and the back and forth. So Dragana will start just in a moment. We will then have Gopal Mitra from UNICEF, and we have a late change to the programme, so we're going to have Rachel Casson from LEAP Ireland is our third panellist who will be arriving in shortly. So just a very brief introduction of Dragana Ciric Milovanovic. I've probably totally mispronounced Dragana's name, but anyway. Dragana is a psychologist and a disability rights advocate. Currently, Dragana is acting as European Regional Office Director of Disability Rights International, an advocacy organisation dedicated to the protection and oversight of the rights of persons with disabilities worldwide. And Dragana was also a founder of Mental Disability Rights Initiative in Serbia, an affiliate of Disability Rights International, an organisation founded back in 2008. And the full bio for Dragana is in your programme. So without further delay, I'll hand you over to Dragana to make the first presentation from our panel this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today and returning to Galway. Pleasure as always. I will talk about the right to live independently and being included in the community. And for the just introduction, I don't think it's a coincidence that we started unpacking the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities with regard to children, introducing on Article 12 and Article 19. So having an agency and also living in the community is a precondition for achieving all other rights guaranteed by the Convention, along with Article 5, which is right to non-discrimination. But I believe the Article 12 and Article 19 are really crucial for enjoyment of all other human rights. Disability Rights International has been documented human rights abuses in institutions for 30 years now. We worked in Southeastern and Eastern Europe, in many countries in Latin America, and started exposing abuses, something that was not visible and was not known when Disability Rights International was founded. When we started working, people in institutions were not recognized, were not visible, and abuses were not, people were not aware of all the abuses taking place in these segregated facilities. Under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, when it comes to children, Article 19 actually, right to live independently and being included in the community for children means to be able to grow up in a family. And I think the best illustration for that was when Petra said that the most important thing for her was that she had support from her family from the very beginning. And recognizing that for children, the crucial thing is to grow up in a family and have support of important adults in a child's life is something that make inclusion at a later age, transition to adulthood possible, and without inclusion at the earliest age and segregation that still takes place around the world, that is not really achievable. And I'll go back to why we are facing so many obstacles in realizing the right to live independently, being included in the community, when we have all the international law and guarantees. Why is it so hard to implement the right to be included in the community? So first, we started with really documenting abuses, very grave abuses in large institutions that were mainly currently still present in Eastern Europe, but they were present everywhere. And we know that they existed in the United States, all around the world, now taking different shapes and forms. Abuses are unfortunately still present, and more than 10 million children and young people are still being placed in institutions of all kinds, large and small. And even reforms that were taking place to deinstitutionalize children, of course, left out children with disabilities. And the transformation itself really didn't happen the way we think should happen, that children were often not included in community, but rather transferred to smaller institutions. And we've been working for the last 5 years documenting abuses now in group homes, something that's by the Convention on the Rights of the Child considered as appropriate or acceptable form of care for children, especially for children with disabilities that they still deem unable to live in the community. So we are challenging this practice, and CRPD is something that is offering us standards and some new standards that I will touch upon a little bit further in my presentation. So what we witnessed in recent years is that countries take so-called band-aid approach or fast solutions of rather building smaller institutions, investing a lot of money, hundreds of millions of euros, for example, in Bulgaria, into building small group homes as a transition to community living. What it proves to be is that children with disabilities are first left out of such reforms, but even if they are transferred to small group homes, they stay there for all their lives. So that's not a transition when it comes to children with disabilities, because there is no support to transition to adulthood and transition to independent living. So they are able to exercise their right to be included in the community. And also what we witnessed is that one of the solutions is renaming of institutions, and segregation takes many different forms. We know that there are boarding schools that segregate children with disabilities, and it is a form of institution. So according to the convention, any placement of a child in a segregated setting is institutionalization, and that should not be negotiable. Unfortunately, standards that still exist within the Convention on the Rights of the Child are making it a little bit difficult for us to implement the rights guaranteed by the CRPD. So there is alleged, so say, discrepancy between something that is written in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And yesterday Rosemary touched upon it, saying that there is no unified standard, which is not really true. If we know that the Convention of the Rights of the Child recognizes that there will be higher standards and that Convention should be interpreted in line with these higher standards, that we don't really have a conflict. However, since the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been present for such a long time, people still believe, and because of widespread prejudice, that there are still children that cannot be deinstitutionalized and will have to remain in group placements of some kind. According to the CRPD, the institution is any place that is not a family. And that is something that we've been using in our advocacy trying to pressure governments, but also donors, not to support any kind of segregated placement for children. And children are placed on different grounds, but mostly because of poverty and because of disability, either of a child or a parent. So apparently are placed in institutions only because there is no support in the community, because there is no access to education, health, because there is no opportunity to exercise all their rights. And we heard yesterday as well that sort of when you are only able to access certain supports in institutions, that's not really a choice. And guidelines on deinstitutionalization that were developed and published last autumn in September 2022 are addressing this issue. So there is also besides discussing a choice, whether that it can ever be a choice that someone can be placed in an institution and deprived of their liberty, including children, which is often used as an argument by service providers that are providing child care and residential services. It is used like, well, some children choose to live in an institution. Whether that's a real choice and why it comes, why it happens, it's a completely different thing. Another argument that is commonly used, and there is, of course, recognition that deinstitutionalization takes time, and that it is subject to progressive realization. However, the element of discrimination on which children are being institutionalized is not something that's subject to progressive realization. It requires immediate it requires to be immediately addressed by the governments, prohibiting any further institutionalization of both children and adults. But for children, it is especially important because early institutionalization and placement in institution results in severe consequences to the child development. And it's also applicable to all children because institutions cause disabilities. It's not just that children are placed in institution on the basis of disabilities. It is also the fact that institutions cause disabilities and children stay in segregated and isolated because of the neglect and abuse they experienced early on in their childhood. So I mentioned that to address the alleged conflict in international law, CRPD committee first established a working group with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, trying to come together to a common understanding of the issues that they have found challenging in harmonizing especially their practice and recommendations that they're giving to government, and residential care being one of the issues has been part of that discussion. Unfortunately, they were not able to reach really meaningful understanding. But at the same time, we had COVID-19 crisis, which just emphasized the dangers of segregated settings, whether they're large and small. And we saw that COVID had enormous impact on the right of children to live in the community, but also to their education and all other consequences that happened as a result of this emergency in shape of a COVID-19. And we are now seeing that similar to countries that are experiencing climate change consequences, that are experiencing armed conflict. My organization is now involved in conflict in Ukraine, where we are trying to influence the international funding that's going now toward Ukraine to make sure that it's not going toward rebuilding of institutions, but rather to provide support to families to be able to keep their child. and care for their child in the community. So as a continuation of that process, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities established a working group to develop guidelines on deinstitutionalization, because despite understanding that institutionalization presents abuse in itself and discrimination in itself, it was still a practice, and there was still huge barriers in implementing this right, as I already mentioned. So despite the general comment number 5, elaborating on the Article 19 on living independently and being included in the community, and also guidelines on Article 14 on the privation of liberty, there was still misunderstanding by member states what are their obligations to make the right to live independently and be included in the community a reality for both children and adults with disabilities. And one of the main things, I think, why this process was unique is that the committee put up front or wanted to listen to the voices of people who were exposed, survivors, or people who are still in institutions, because all the plans for the institutionalization are very often designed without participation of those who are actually affected by this practice. And I think this made the process really unique, and it is in line with, we all know the motto, nothing about us without us. That has to be respected when it comes to children with disabilities in institutions who are often denied an opportunity at all to be heard and to speak about what they want and what are their wishes and preferences. So the guidelines address several really important issues, including the issue of intersectionality and how different characteristics affect the right of children and adults with disabilities to be included in the community. Some of the things that the guidelines confirm, for example, that they confirm the dangers of institutions, that what it means for children really to be deprived of family life and opportunity to develop and be included and receive early intervention, inclusive education, which all leads to lack of skills that are necessary for them to transition to adulthood and get employment. So this is all really a life cycle that we need to look at understanding that institutionalization leads to deprivation of all other experiences that are necessary for independent living and community inclusion. The guidelines also talk about universal protections for all children, and that goes back to what I mentioned, that institutions, while children with disabilities are predominantly placed, they also cause disabilities even when children are being placed when initially not having identified disability at the very beginning. It also identifies elements that are needed to implement the right to be included, and some of it is support for children with disabilities and families as early as possible, so importance of prevention of institutionalization that has to be incorporated and mainstreamed in all aspects of community living. And even short placement outside of family can cause great suffering and emotional and physical impairments. The second element that I would like to emphasize is the right for children with disabilities, like all other children, to be heard on matters that affect them, and that their views are given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity and without discrimination based on disability or gender. And that goes to the importance of participation in the very process of developing the guidelines, where the committee heard a lot of testimonies by persons, including young people with disabilities. What I also mentioned is the issue of choice. And the guidelines confirm that children and adolescents with disabilities cannot choose to live in an institution, as you cannot choose to be abused and neglected. So there is no real choice when the only choice is to be segregated and isolated. So there is not something that we can at all consider as acceptable, and we can discuss that maybe in line with the choice looked from the other lenses, but there can be no choice really to live in an institution. And young persons with disabilities should instead be offered an opportunity and receive support to choose to live independently. If they don't want to live with their family, they need to have a choice to live independently with appropriate supports. And bearing in mind, again, that independent living arrangements refer to all settings outside of residential institutions of all kinds. So supported living that, again, relies on group placement of young people with disabilities is not something that's acceptable by the Convention. And what states should really do is develop a comprehensive support and mainstream services that are inclusive, that will enable inclusion in the society of children and young people, and consequently adults with disabilities, because if we prevent institutionalization at the early age, we will be able to prevent institution in the adulthood. So things as accessible environment, transportation, information, communication, inclusive education, access to health, everything that we will be discussing later this week, these are all crucial really to achieving the right to live independently and being included in the community, and also inclusion in the community. The implementation of all these rights is not possible if we keep segregating and isolating children. And guidelines itself, same as the convention, same as any law, are not enough. We have to use them. These are tools that we as human rights disability advocates need to use and put pressure on governments, on international donors, which are playing a significant role in many countries, supporting the institutionalization process. What are really things that they should support? What are the recommendations that we have to give? But the most importantly, we have to empower children and young people with disabilities to speak out and to advocate for their rights. And I also mean children in institutions, which is challenging, and very often because of that challenge it doesn't happen, but it doesn't mean that we should put all efforts that we can to make their voices heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dragana, and that was very comprehensive and detailed in relation to not just beyond the guidelines, but also in relation to the guidelines on deinstitutionalization. And I'm sure members of the audience will have questions and picking up on points to make for Dragana when we have the discussion after our next two speakers. So next up is Gopal Mitra, who's joining us online. And Gopal works with UNICEF. Gopal is UNICEF's Global Lead on Disability. Global Lead on Disability and Development in the Programme Group based out of New York, UN headquarters, where he provides strategic and technical leadership to deliver on UNICEF's global commitments on disability inclusion across the organisation. Previously, Gopal was a senior social affairs officer in the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. So I hope we're joined by Gopal. Hello, Gopal. It's still good morning. Good morning to you in Ireland.
Thank you, and very good morning. It's a pleasure to be part of this session, and I really enjoyed Dragana's reflections. And sorry, couldn't be there with you all in person.
Next time.
Yes, of course. And okay, let me give some reflections on how what we see is happening, some of the efforts that are needed, some of them underway, to enable children with disabilities to live independently and in their communities. In 2021, UNICEF published a global data report on children with disabilities. It's called Seen, Counted, Included. Please feel free to Google, or I can send a link later on as a part of the resource package. And the report revealed that, not surprisingly, and that children with disabilities are faring badly on major child well-being domains. 49% more likely to never have attended school, 34% more likely to be stunted, and among many other worse outcomes, right? And these directly have an impact on what we are discussing today. The world faces multiple crises: the conflict in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, we have the climate crisis, and I was told the COVID crisis ended, but it has left a huge impact. And that puts people under a lot of stress. And we know that during times of crisis, people with disabilities, children with disabilities, and their families face disproportionate impact. A study in Philippines has shown that families who have children with disabilities have 40 to 80% extra cost. As a study in Madagascar shows that families are very likely to send their children with disabilities to live with extended families who are better off and who have better access to services. A survey in Kenya shows that 40% of the mothers saying that they were pressurized by their community to kill their children with disabilities. So that is the situation. Article 19 clearly states that persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities, cannot be segregated. And it tells two other important things, which I'm going to my reflections will focus on. Article 19 also clearly obliges states to make services available for persons with disabilities in their families and children with disabilities in their families and their communities. It also states clearly that support services and services in the community that is meant for the general population should also be equally accessible to persons with disabilities. UNICEF has been, last year, the data shows that it has worked in more than 100 countries to support care reforms. And UNICEF's work on care reforms is based on three priorities. First, it's to prevent separation of children. The second is to prioritize alternative care for children who need it. And the third is to end institutionalization of children with disabilities. And our strategic plan, our child protection strategy, as well as the newly launched disability inclusion policy and strategy in February this year, clearly articulates that. In fact, one of the 6 strategic priorities of the disability inclusion policy and strategy is to ensure community-based care and support, and to further invest time and energy to strengthen it. And there are several others, which I'm going to refer to in course of my reflections. Now, when we're talking about the approach to care reforms, It's based on a 5-point agenda, which brings together institution of laws, policies, programs, and services in child protection, but overall in the broader context of education, social protection, and health. And I think Dragana referred to several of them in course of her presentation. And the first of the 5 points is to ensure family laws, policies, services, and programs that are family responsive and that prevent separation of children through support to families in a meaningful way. The second is to create an economy that values care for parents, for families, for grandparents, through programs, through services, social protection, etc. The third is to bring more resources as investment towards family-based care and support services. And the fourth is to collect data and strengthen data on children who are outside family care. And the fifth is to strengthen social child protection systems and build the capacity of social service workforce. Now, to give you a few examples, for example, in South Africa, UNICEF did an audit of the migrant children alternative care. And a mapping was done which identified 700 children who were in alternative care, and specific initiatives were undertaken to connect them to case management and for referral and access to other services. In Mozambique, for example, UNICEF did a feasibility study to transfer the national registry on alternative care, which was still in paper format, into electronic format. And a feasibility, and it was piloted. It is being piloted in Maputo. This resulted not only in reintegration of children with disabilities with their families, but also provided a systematic trajectory by converting and by better data management. In Cambodia, for example, UNICEF launched a big behavior change campaign to change social norms. More than 10,000 families, school teachers, school directors were involved, and which had a significant focus on children with disabilities. In Nepal, for example, during COVID, the focus was on families of children with disabilities who lost their carers due to migration, due to COVID-19, and to identify families who had a bigger burden of care and to support them with services. In Greece, for example, UNICEF has produced guidelines and tools on deinstitutionalization and has launched campaigns along with the Prime Minister's office on foster care. So there are a lot of efforts underway. UNICEF has also developing a child protection competency framework for frontline workers that will enable better management of the workforce and building their capacity. Along with all of them, one area which is being globally gaining a lot of traction is the care agenda. And UNICEF believes that proper meaningful care and support services in the community will go a long way to enable children with disabilities to live independently and in their families and in their communities. Early identification and assessment of children with disabilities is underway in many countries to find out how many children with disabilities, where they are, and what are the rights needs. Needs mostly. There are programs underway in Uganda, in Peru, in several countries, we are trying to strengthen the national information management systems so that children with disabilities, when they enter into the information system, are also are better connected to services. Inclusive education is a big part of this puzzle. In more than 120 countries, UNICEF is working to strengthen inclusive education because we know historically the opportunity to provide education was one of the reasons children with disabilities were sent to institutions. So we really need to strengthen and inclusive education. We've seen some progress in this area, and it is also important because when children with disabilities are not going to school, there is all the burden of care for the family also increases. There is cash transfers is a vital element of this approach. Meaningful cash transfers to families often result in families being able to better support their children and prevent institutionalization. In 2022, UNICEF supported 794,000 children with disabilities and their families with cash transfers. And there is a very good program in Syria, for example, where children with disabilities and their families there's a cash transfer program for them, which takes into account the additional cost of disability. Another important issue is provisioning of assistive technology, because we know that assistive technology increases the independence of children and adults with disabilities, and it reduces the requirement for human assistance. So UNICEF is using its program as well as procurement capacity to significantly enhance the provisioning of assistive technology and devices for children with disabilities. One area where we see a big gap is the provisioning of critical services like personal assistance, respite care, such facilities, sign language interpreters at the community level, at a place where children with disabilities and people with disabilities live. There are some innovative examples which you have seen where public works are paying for respite care and so on for children with disabilities and their families. But this area needs to be further drilled into and to understand and to develop a sort of a roadmap of how such community-based services can be provided. So UNICEF in 2023, February, launched its a comprehensive disability inclusion policy and strategy, with aiming to significantly accelerate and scale up disability inclusion across its programs and internal operations. There are 6 cross-sectoral strategic priorities, and I will end with them. The first is to prevent stigma and discrimination, violence, neglect, and abuse of children with disabilities, a lot of which happens within institutional settings. Strengthen inclusive and accessible programs and infrastructure. Strengthen provisioning of community care services and support. Strengthen provisioning of assistive technology. Increase investment and action on disability inclusive humanitarian action, and significantly increase involvement of children and adults with disabilities across our world. On the request of the CRPD committee in 2015, UNICEF developed public guidelines on consulting children with disabilities, which has become very popular within the organization at the country level, and countries are using it. We did a mapping in East Asia and Pacific to see how the UNICEF country offices are working with organizations of persons with disabilities. And we found that over 80% of our country offices are engaging quite significantly, many of them, with organizations of persons with disabilities, because we feel that this connection and this relationship is extremely important. And the work that I spoke about, UNICEF, is done in close collaboration with governments as well as with the civil society and the networks that are there on the ground, both nationally and globally. I'll stop there and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Gopal, many thanks. You were getting a signed round of applause there in the room here, and I'm sure with others watching on Zoom online. And now we'll move to our final speaker of this panel on independent living and being included in the community. And we're grateful to Rachel for joining us at short notice. Rachel Casson is the director of LEAP, a social enterprise which empowers families to take action for an inclusive life. And LEAP works with families to build their knowledge, capacity and skills and to challenge existing attitudes and beliefs. And Rachel has served previously on various different government committees, including on Transforming Lives, the HSC programme, and the Task Force on Personalised Budget. So over to Rachel to share her thoughts on living independently and being included in the community. Many thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Colin. How long have I got?
As long as you wish. Well, 20 minutes maximum.
Okay,
We'll
thank
stop
you.
you. Down here, we'll get very irate if you run over 20 minutes, but take as long as you wish, because I know it's short notice.
Okay, can you give me a notice when I've got 5 minutes left? Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Great to be here today, and hi to everybody online. Also, so I was to be part of a panel later on, but I've just jumped in here because I believe someone became unavailable at short notice. So just trying to put a few thoughts together that will add value to the previous two speakers' presentations. So spoke with Eleanor and thought I might share a little bit with you all about an initiative that my organisation took during the last part of COVID, and that is an inclusive neighbourhoods initiative in the small town in Westmeath where LEAP has opened its HQ. And we bought this property during COVID. Actually, it's quite a nice story. We had a little piece of money kind of growing in the bank, very small amount of money, because we weren't able to travel like all of you. During COVID, we weren't able to run workshops. Our only cost, I think, was our Zoom subscription. I'm sure that sounds very familiar. So we managed to put that together as a deposit for a property in rural Westmeath. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ireland, that's right in the middle of the country, very much a farming community, quite old-fashioned. And our town, like many rural towns, had experienced a hollowing out. There was lots of internal emigration and young people leaving in their droves to go and seek better lives elsewhere. So lots of derelict housing around the town square. 28% of properties were derelict. I'm happy to report that since then, the hotel, which had been closed for a number of years and was starting to grow sort of plants out of its roof and so on, has been reopened. So that's about 7% right there has come back into usage, which is super. But it's still a place where you need money to go, right? And not everybody can sit in a hotel for more than an hour and keep sort of paying to have a fresh coffee or a fresh tea or whatever. So we were looking, alongside opening up our HQ for LEAP, and until then, LEAP had operated with a laptop and a smartphone and driven around the country. It's amazing what you can do as a small social enterprise with those three things: a car, a laptop, and a smartphone, huh? So we'd done that for about 10 years, but we got quite tired of it. So we'd got our first building, and we looked around and we realized there's actually a great opportunity here to set up a community enterprise. So we had 1/2 acre of land, we had a cottage that was in bits, and we had a hall, 80 square meters, so quite a substantial sized hall. So we decided that we were going to look at an inclusive neighbourhoods initiative. What we mean by that is a project where everybody is welcome. So we started off thinking about what that would look like, what we would do, and what sort of principles we would set up the project around. And then we managed to invite 9 neighbours, including 2 of us from LEAP, to set up an association. And we began to work with those neighbours, very ordinary people, some of whom had arrived in this small town during COVID, had young children and knew nobody, and invited them to sit with us and think about what this Inclusive Neighbourhoods initiative would look like. And fast forward to today, just over a year later, it's extraordinary. Having run LEAP for 12 years on what my partner would call the clippings of tin, in other words, absolutely bugger all money. To date, the Water Street Association has managed to attract quite a large 6-figure sum of funding. So that was the first thing that really interested us. Why is it when we step out of the space of talking around disabled children and their families into a wider kind of a community development type space, how is it that suddenly funding is coming from all over the place? Really interesting departments we'd never had anything to do with before. In fact, for the 12 years we've been running LEAP, it was really the HSE. For those of you who know Ireland and where disability funding comes from, that's the health service executive, very much the medical model. So suddenly we're getting funding from, I don't know, the Heritage Council, the Arts Council, well, Creative Westmeath, which is very similar to Arts Council type funding, and biodiversity organisations, all sorts of organisations were interested in what we were doing as we talked about building community. Now, I was talking to one of our local councillors, county councillors recently, and I said, yeah, we're really interested in new roles in the community, like community builders. And he said, oh, right, Rachel, so you want a list of tradesmen? And I was like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Community building, you know, community navigators, community connectors, whatever you want to call them. I don't really use the term soft roles anymore around people and families because they're not soft, are they? We've just had research in that shows Ireland, in fact, has the highest reported rates of loneliness of anywhere else in Europe. So this is, you know, this is quite staggering. And everybody I've said that to, they're like, really? Ireland? Sure, aren't we very friendly? Haven't we got a welcome for everybody? And there's all these kind of ideas, isn't there, about Irish society. But actually, guess who's the loneliest? Who would you think? It's young people, right? It's actually people under 30. So that's also quite interesting because there's lots of stereotypes too about loneliness, isn't there? That it's older people, you know. Sad little old ladies sitting at home knitting and supping tea, isn't it? That's the stereotype. But actually, it's younger people. So I digress. So the Water Street Association is about building community for everybody. And within the year and a couple of months that we've opened our doors, we've set up a number of things, let's call them things. And one of our principles is that we're not there to provide things as entertainment for the community. We're there to ask neighbours, if you and 1 or 2 of your friends did something around here to make life even better, what would that look like? And behind it all, we are, as ever, we are in LEAP, completely committed to inclusion. So we actively encourage everybody to get involved in everything we do. And so far, the most success we've had with that is with children and young people, which ties in nicely here. So we've been running a number of week-long summer camps for children and young people. And from the community garden that we've developed, The young people are encouraged to pick some salad leaves to add to their dinner that they're making, you know, their tomato sauce and pasta, and hopefully we've got some of our own tomatoes and other veg to add to the sauce. And this year we're doing 2 weeks of outdoor eco art camps. So the theme is, you know, biodiversity. The children will be creating a mural. There's lots of lovely things happening. And we've got one of the association members, a South African artist who would describe herself as neurodivergent. She is running the 2 weeks of art classes. They sold out within a day because we kept the price, I think it's €25 for the week. And parents kept saying, is that for the day? And we said, no, that's for the week. And because we've got a little bit of funding, we can keep the costs low. But as you know, those of you who have children or nieces or nephews and live in Ireland, the cost of summer camps for children can be up to €140 per week. So 25 or 30 is very, very low. And what we found last year was that 20% of the young people coming to the art camps had a disability. So that was great. So we didn't mention, and we don't mention, and you can feed back to me whether you think this is an idea or not, because really at this point we're just trying out some ideas. We didn't mention anything about disability, and we've decided unless people come to us and they absolutely say they need a separate space, then we're going to try and make everything universal, open to everybody. So that's what we've been doing at the moment, but we're very open to feedback from our neighbours, from the wider community, and obviously from you here now as we share some of what we've been doing. So where did this all come from? So I suppose during COVID, we realised a few things. So I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. So LEAP is a family-led organisation. During COVID, LEAP stewarded into existence our first inclusive neighbourhoods initiative called the Water Street Association. So LEAP invests in a network of families because we believe families are foundational in their capacity to pursue inclusive lives and to drive social change. Now, this is the point where I look down a lot because I'm a visual thinker and I'm not using slides, so I'm reading a little bit to you from slides here now that I would have otherwise had up here. So apologise for that. So during COVID, we saw that families in our network, and it's the first time, what, would it be in 100 years, that services just closed, didn't they? They just shut down. So families were absolutely desperate in many situations, and the services just showed them the hard face, really they did. The staff kept getting paid, but no services were forthcoming. Now, there was Zoom activity, okay, but we all know that that's a very poor substitute for actual services. So families were desperate, really, really desperate in some cases to get assistance. And we were advocating at the highest level to Leo Varadkar and to ministers in the government at the time to actually give cash money, much as was the previous speaker, Gopal, yeah? Much as Gopal was talking about cash assistance, hard cash to families, because that's what they were saying they needed, plus some equipment into the home, okay? But no, nothing was forthcoming. So we began to realize that we began to see that families who were more connected to their community were more resilient to these closures and were coping better. And it was a horrible time for everybody, absolutely horrible time for everybody. So we thought about that, and we thought about beginning with this first initiative to actually create inclusive neighbourhoods. And you might say to me, well, neighbourhoods are inclusive anyway, Rachel. And I'd love to hear about your inclusive neighbourhood. But what we had found was that there was both types of discrimination, I suppose, if you call indifference discrimination. That was very, very prevalent in our small community, that families were living very much hidden in plain sight in our community. They had withdrawn from social interaction because they had experienced rejection in community, in ordinary clubs and groups in community, in schools in community. And they weren't kind of coming in and connecting to whatever club or group they might, led by their child's likes and interests. So, for example, in our small town and all around Ireland, GAA, the Gaelic Athletics Association, is huge. But it's a competitive sporting organisation. So you've got to be good at hurling, and you've got to be good at the different sports that they offer. And you've got to be, you know, really into kind of training a lot and compete. And that doesn't suit a lot of children and young people, and it doesn't suit some children with disabilities. So what we are hoping ultimately is that we will spark interest and ambition in other communities led by families, that similar projects will open. So families in Athenry are very interested in doing something like this. Families in Athboy in County Meath. So Athenry is County Galway, by the way. Athboy is a small town in County Meath. So there is a history to this. So again, at the beginning of COVID, 18 of us from around the country did a 6-week online course in asset-based community development. So looking at, you know, the whole strengths, assets, gifts of a community, including all sorts of things you'd never think about. And that training was led by a man called Cormac Russell. So Cormac said and he's working with John McKnight, who many of you would know is the father of asset-based community development. He's now, I think, in his late 80s or maybe his 90s, still living in the States, still writing about asset-based community development. But John and Cormac would often say that in all their years working in this field, and they've travelled all over the world, worked with many governments and so on, that they've rarely seen asset-based community development that is successful, particularly in including people with intellectual disabilities, okay? So from day one, that was our challenge. You know, we're thinking, well, what can we do different here? What can we do different? You know what the biggest challenge we're finding is? That services have colonized those individuals and their families. And it's actually really, really hard to hold that line where we say, okay, at the community garden every Saturday, sure, if Mary is really interested in trying some gardening, beyond those geraniums she's growing on her windowsill, Mary can come. Yeah, you can come as her supporter, but you're not bringing the whole bus. You're not bringing the whole group home. You know, so this is what we're finding is quite challenging, that we don't want the Water Street Association to become a disability service centre. So we're trying to include people in typical proportions, right? That's not the right phrase. What do I mean? In the ways that, what's the phrase? Somebody help me out here. What's the phrase I'm looking for?
Proportion of wider society, is it?
Yeah.
Reflective of society.
Reflective of society. Thank you, Colin. So trying to explain that can sometimes take a long time, but what we're trying to avoid is that scenario which we see in services quite a lot, whereby, let's say there's a lovely new knitting group starts up in the local parish centre, and the service hear about it, and they go, great, let's bring all the ladies, right? So they bring all the ladies, and then everybody else leaves. So that's not community inclusion. So community inclusion it's an art form, and yeah, we're finding it hard, and we've got very little to tell you beyond what I've just told you already, which is with children and young people whose families are delighted that things are open. We don't advertise any different from any other summer camp or any other event. When they arrive, they're delighted to see that their children are very warmly welcomed and are supported very discreetly by those of us on the association to make sure that they have an optimal experience. They're delighted to see that, and why wouldn't they be? Any of us would feel very, very happy in that regard. Also then the community garden. We have, interestingly, a lot of people with mental health issues coming to that. And we have, at times, nearly had to separate people over the cabbage patch. There'll be big fights, there'll be big rows. One time there was a really huge row between a woman in her late 80s and a man in his 50s about whose fault it was we hadn't thinned the beetroot out sufficiently. And, you know, people can get very, very heated, very, very heated. So holding that space and not ever wanting to expel anyone is very, very difficult. And I had to laugh. I'm going to say this. I talked about whether I would say this, but I decided I would say. I talked to my colleague about this. When I saw the Discord rules, I thought, oh, golly, imagine if I tried to introduce those into the Water Street Association. People just, we're not there, you know, we're not there. And we do have... we had a horrible incident with an older lady recently where she used a really awful, the most awful word. And what do? So we're just trying, have you heard of sociocracy as an organizing? Have a look at sociocracy. It's very interesting. It's a way of kind of, I suppose it's a democratic process for organizations, a way of making decisions. So I spoke last week at the Making Neighborhoods seminar and Project Art Centre in Dublin, and a lot of people looking at making neighbourhoods and placemaking, and a lot of them were architects and designers and so on. But they're not community builders, and they're not necessary. They're very good at the process around buildings, but they're not so strong on the people side or the process with people. I'm getting a sign now that I should finish. I hope that wasn't too desperately rambly, but thank you for listening to me. Thank you.